G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Afraid I have to play devil's advocate here to a certain extent and go into bat for a fairly despicable human called Eric Abetz. For those of you who haven't heard of him, Eric Abetz is the Australian Federal Liberal Government Minister for close bracket, employment. Eric Abetz is the bloke who thinks that unemployed people should be forced to prove that they have applied for 40 jobs a month, that they should have no payments for 6 months, and they should work 25 hours per week for free, and at the end of that time they get their first federal government assistance in the form of unemployment benefits. And after another 6 months, then they go back on 6 months of no payments. So I really don't like the man. I think he's a complete moron. I think he's likely to do more to tear the fabric of Australian society to pieces than anything that's happened since the Great Depression of the 1880s, 1860s, right? It's insane. It is utterly insane. But we're not going to talk about Eric Abetz' unemployment policies. We're here because last week Eric Abetz made a comment to a journalist and was reported and then pilloried in the press because he said that there was a link. He said a link. I don't know that he said a causal link. He said a link between abortion and breast cancer. And he said that there was research dating back to the 1950s which established a link between having had an abortion and going on to develop breast cancer. And mate, they pilloried him. They ripped 6 new colostomies where his arsehole should have been. They tore into him. The fact that he is a right-wing neo-fascist liberal politician and he is against abortion meant that he was treated as if there was absolutely no excuse for him to have said what he said. But I was thinking about it. Back in the 1950s, and let's get clear here, they said that if he quoted any research that dated back to the 1950s, then that tagged where his attitudes were, and therefore he was a moron and nothing because he shouldn't be allowed out without having a keeper to put him on a leash. So I guess that means that we junk antibiotics, do we? Because, like that dates to the 1940s and Howard Florey and penicillin. Do we junk germ theory entirely? Koch, Pasteur and Leeuwenhoek, they thought there were these tiny little invisible things that you couldn't see that were causing people to get sick. Bacteria, they called them, animalcules, and then viruses and prions. Should we just junk that because it's not the latest, greatest, most politically correct research? Somehow I don't think so. Let's have a look at what was going on in 1950. Now, back then, abortion was illegal, right? Abortion might have had a 100% death rate for the fetuses, but back in the 1950s and indeed in Australia right up until the 1970s, abortion had a 25% death rate for the mothers or the pregnant women, the women who wanted to not be pregnant, because it was always done illegally. If it was being done by qualified people in a suitable situation, it was being done in secrecy. Right? When I was in primary school, my uncle, who was a licensed private inquiry agent, came to town for a visit, stayed for a while, made inquiries, and later the town's doctor was prosecuted for conducting officially appendectomies, and he was actually relieving those who could afford to pay of their unwanted fetuses. Now that was when I was in my last year of primary school, maybe the second last year, so 1971, perhaps 72. By 1974, 75, abortion was legal in Australia. So sometime while I was off at the first boarding school, the law changed and abortion became legal and the death rate dropped to infinitesimally small. A fraction of 1% rather than 25% among the pregnant women who were going up for abortion. What's also true is that half the survivors were permanently sterile as a result of, childbed fever without the baby, more or less, septic abortion, puerperal fever. It killed an awful lot, but some survived, and those who survived generally had emergency hysterectomies. If they didn't have emergency hysterectomies, they certainly had a lot of scar tissue. So they didn't go on to have a baby, right? And because it was such a squalid, illegal, terrifying, painful, horrible procedure to have an illegal abortion, there weren't too many women who had more than one of them. So you wind up with a lot of women who survived having an abortion, like half, were never able to have a baby, and most women who had abortion were having an abortion on their first pregnancy. It was an unwanted pregnancy. Well, maybe not most, because I suppose there were perhaps some pregnant women who were having an abortion after already having lots of kids. But the preponderance of women who were having abortions because they were pregnant teenagers and they were terrified. At least that's the received wisdom. So I've been told by time expired nuns who were teaching me obstetrics and gynecology back in the 1980s, people who were around at the time. So you wind up with a fair number of people who survive their first abortion. They don't have that baby, they go on to not be able to have a baby. So they're in the category of women who never get to ever breastfeed, because the only way to breastfeed is to have a live baby and then feed it. Right. Now I'm guessing, and it's a wild guess, but I think it's guessing on a probability. I'm guessing that the number of women who've had an abortion and then had no children is a greater percentage than the number of women who've never had an abortion that have no children. Right? Back in the days when contraceptives were condoms as thick as gumboots, everything was a bit iffy, and an awful lot of the people who found themselves surprisingly pregnant as a teenager either put the baby up for adoption or they had a shotgun wedding. Very few of them tried to keep the baby on their own because there was no single mother's pension. But anyway, my conjecture is that, considering that lactation is protective against breast cancer to the tune of maybe dropping somebody's likelihood by 50%, it's long been considered that lactating lowers somebody's background likelihood of developing breast cancer. If somebody's had an abortion the first time they were pregnant and they've come out of that sterile, they're never going to lactate. So that will have doubled, effectively, their chances of developing breast cancer because of the no lactation clause, right? Lactation is protective against breast cancer. If you have an abortion the first time you're pregnant and it sterilises you because it was an illegal procedure back in the 50s, when whoever it was dug up the figures and brought it to Eric Abets' attention. So yeah, it probably did all make sense then. What you can jump on Eric Abets for is that he hasn't mentioned all the other intervening factors. It would be as if I was to jump up and down and say, oh, latest, greatest research came out within the last 3 months. Heard it on Radio National. Read it in New Scientist. Red meat causes breast cancer. Every serving of red meat a woman has per day raises her chance of breast cancer by 30%. Right? Which is true. You have red meat for breakfast, breast cancer rate just rose by 30%. On whatever it was, doesn't matter whether you got a family history, doesn't matter whether you got a genetic predisposition. If you eat red meat 1 meal a day, up by 30%. 2 meals a day, up by 60%. 3 meals a day, up by 90%. Oh, any woman can almost double her chance of breast cancer by eating 3 meals containing red meat per day. Doesn't matter what species of meat. It can be sheep, it can be pigs, it can be cows, horses, hippopotamus, elephants if you want. Red meat, up your rate of breast cancer by 30%. Now, if I said that and just left it there, that would be sensationalist scaremongering. It would be a one-eyed squinting at the statistics, because although what I said is true, I'm not putting it in context. I'm not mentioning that the same survey, the same research, which found that 1 feed of red meat per day, so 7 meals per week, raises a woman's chance by 30% of developing breast cancer. All that same research also said the total number of breast cancers caused by eating red meat is 9% of the whole. Right? 9% of all breast cancers are caused by eating red meat. But individually, whatever your chances were, 1 meal of red meat per day up your chances by 30%. It's all true and it's all scary. But it means that in absolute terms, there are probably still some women who have an abortion the first time they get pregnant, and for whatever reason, they never ever get pregnant again. Maybe they got jilted and dumped by somebody who said that he loved her. Maybe they get turned off men forever. Maybe there's a surgical problem crops up during the event and something happens and they wind up not being able to conceive afterwards. But I would suspect there may still be a higher rate of women who've had one abortion and no child than women who've never had an abortion who don't have children. Just a guess, just a guess. Like I said, I'm surmising. So it's faintly possible that Eric Abetz has had his arse kicked out through his ear holes for no actual valid scientific reason. He's been jumped on and hammered by the politically correct feminazis who cannot bear to contemplate the idea that abortion is not an absolute unalloyed good, because that is their ideological position. Their ideological position is that nobody is allowed to suggest that there's anything negative as a consequence which can flow from abortion on request. As far as I understand, that entire segment of the population, they have a lump sort of 4.5 feet high in the middle of their lounge room, and they have to walk around that lump every time they go to the toilet or come back in to go to the kitchen. The lump is because it's sticking up where they swept under the carpet all of the research, which came out 5-10 years ago, pointing out that depression, acute depression, predisposes to suicide, and that women who have had abortions have a maybe double, maybe higher than double rate of developing acute depression. And the political correct feminazi stormtroopers decided that nobody was allowed to draw the conclusion that having an abortion was a bad idea because it predisposed you to acute depression, and acute depression predisposed you to suicide. So they swept that one under the carpet in the interest of feminazi ideological position, of purity and correctness of stance, rather than accept the fact that there may actually be some associational linkage which is worthy of further investigation. They just squelched all polite conversation on the topic. Nobody knows if the link between having a termination and developing depression is because of the termination, or because of the life situation surrounding the termination, or because of the relationship that resulted in the pregnancy, which then got terminated. Nobody knows, but we do know the link between depression and suicide. And then, of course, the other big lump in the carpet on the subject of suicide is the fact that survivors of child sexual assault have 18 times the death by suicide rate of the background population. Now compare that to combat veterans. Combat veterans have twice the suicide rate of the background population because they might have had a happy childhood. The children of combat veterans have 3 times the death rate of the background population, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics, as reported in the Australian newspaper. So yeah, going to war, that'll give you twice the suicide rate. Being the kid of a combat veteran gives you 3 times the suicide rate. Being sexually abused as a child, 18 times the suicide rate. They also have 48 times the death rate from accidental drug overdose, and the deaths cluster at 18 years after the abusive incident. But nobody from the Beyond Blue Foundation wants to consider the idea that if 95% of the suicides are child sexual assault survivors, then you can probably start deploying the funding in different ways from where they are at the moment, running around in circles wondering why is it so that our children don't want to live in the world that we've made for them. Oh, let's medicate them here, have some Prozac or Zantac or whatever the bloody drugs are, you know. Have some zombie pills. Put a smile on your face, sit happy in your raccoon mask. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Maybe Eric Abetz is at fault for being a zealot and for not mentioning the caveats and not mentioning that it's not a clear-cut thing that having an abortion causes you to have breast cancer. It's a situation of nesting sets. You know, all the people who have breast cancer, or all the people who develop breast cancer are human. Probably 95% of them are women, because some men develop breast cancer. Out of all the people who develop breast cancer, the women who have never breastfed have like 60% incidence. You know, in that all the people who have breast cancer, 60% of them have never breastfed. Having an abortion, surviving the abortion and being rendered sterile, particularly back in 1950, means that you're never ever going to lactate. So you're never going to breastfeed. So you're going to be in that group of people who's never breastfed. But of course, in today's political climate, I doubt that anybody would ever get funding to do the research, to tease it all out and figure out what causes what with whom and what does it all mean anyway. They say the plural of anecdote is not anecdata, but I know if you take a woman who's had 2 live births and 2 abortions, and then she has an abortion, 2 live births and another abortion, at the end of that process, she's a whole lot more scrambled in the head than she was when she'd only had 2 abortions. But that's just a personal observation of one particular case, so it's just an anecdote. But anyway, yeah, I don't think Eric Abetz deserves to be pounded and pulverised and turned into a pulp on the floor of the Australian political arena just because he annoyed the feminists by shooting his mouth off in a half-understood way about something that may have been true once, but ever since abortion became legal and the death rate and the morbidity rate dropped, and most women who have an abortion for the last 40 years have come out of it with their fertility intact. And if their fertility is intact, that whole avenue of failure to lactate leading to breast cancer gets shut down. But by geez, they hammered him hard. They hammered him incredibly hard. So that's my episode of Devil's Advocate, defending the moron who wants to starve unemployed Australians who are under the age of 30, because he doesn't see that that's going to make any difference at all to the crime rates, to the rioting rates on the streets. If somebody's got a choice between starve to death or steal from anybody who seems to be richer than they are, we know what the answer is. That's why England sent Australia to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.